Hey everybody, and welcome for joining us today in the Cars Power Hour. I am Kat. I am one of the MCAT experts at Magoosh, and today we're going to go over some cars tips, and you're actually going to go through a practice cars passage. So we're going to get to all that, but so you can do the cars passage at about the halfway point, check out some of the links there in the chat, because you'll see a link to the actual passage, which you want to pull up. You don't want to start it yet, but pull that up. And if you don't yet have a Magoosh account, in order to pull up the passage, you need to create a trial account. So there's another link there where you can do that. And so I'll just give a little bit of time. I know people are still filtering in, and give you some time to pull those up. Okay, so I know that people are still coming in. You're still probably pulling up some links, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to start by showing a basic overview of what we're going to be covering in the next hour. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over here. So this is the outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about cars. I'm not going to do an extensive introduction. We're going to talk mostly about the question types. And then we're going to go through a timed passage. I'm going to give you 9 minutes to answer 5 questions. That includes reading the passage. Those questions are in our Magoosh product, so you'll be working through it. Just if you're a premium student, you're probably used to that. And then we'll go through the answers. So I'll talk a little bit, mostly about the first choice answer, and then also the second choice that students are most likely to answer as an incorrect answer. So we'll go through those, and then there should be some time left over for some Q&A. So before we get started, I want to do a little poll, and we'll be doing these mostly towards the end of this hour together. But let's start with just a really easy question, and that is, how do you feel about cars? And go ahead and click whichever one seems closest to your experience. So do you mostly feel okay? Do you feel a little bit either anxious or frustrated, very anxious or frustrated? Or maybe you don't know, you're just starting. All right. Okay, so we've got 39% of you feeling mostly okay. And then we have some kind of frustrated. We've got 18% who are pretty new to cars. So I think that regardless of where you're starting right now, hopefully you'll get some good tips. Okay, so there are 3 main categories of cars questions, and you're going to see a distribution that looks basically not just roughly, but exactly like this. So if you start with that light blue pie sector, you see 30% of the questions are just going to ask you about the passage. So these are foundational comprehension questions. In the ACT, that's actually like 80-something%. And in the SAT, it's, I think, 40-something%. And so part of what students find challenging in cars is that they don't see a bigger component that are just asking you basically details about the passage. Instead, you see these other 2 categories. So the dark blue at the bottom, 30%, this is reasoning within the text. And so this is trying to make connections between different parts of the text, knowing what the main purpose is, knowing what the author's position is. These are a little more challenging. And then this third, the orange sector, is where it's the biggest proportion here. 40% are asking you reasoning beyond the text. And this is one of the reasons that cars tends to be fairly challenging, is that what you see are questions that will introduce another element or ask you something related to an analogy. and then you need to sort of figure out the correct answer to what is usually a hypothetical scenario. And so especially for, I know that most of you are science majors or were science majors, are used to interpreting data, focusing on details. These reasoning beyond text when you first start can be pretty challenging. The good news is that through practicing CARS, you get really used to them. You get used to the types of questions they ask. Doesn't mean that you're, gonna always know what they are, of course, the answers, but the question stems themselves, there's a limited number of categories that these question constructions look like. So my top tips for CARS then, no, that's right. Let's go ahead and look a little bit at this last category because it is a little bit unusual, especially if you're used to ACT, SAT. Reasoning beyond the text might look something like this. So the question stem, some who agreed with Ms. Rack's defense of his choice to show the color slides would be most likely to also approve of fill in the blank. And of course, we haven't read this passage. This is an actual AAMC official question. And so we're looking for this hypothetical extra element that is introduced only in this question. What would somebody who shares this position on specifically color slides also approve of? And I think that it's one of the questions you're going to answer today is a reasoning. No, it's a couple of them are reasoning beyond the text questions. So my top tips for CARS, first of all, I recommend practicing 6 days a week, and this will set up a regular routine. People often start out with great intentions, do CARS regularly, and then it's easy to let it slip, especially if you're getting consumed with content review. Maybe, I mean, you all have a lot going on. You know, you've got classes, you've got clinical, there's a lot to juggle. But if you can start the first day of your working day with just, even if it's just one CARS passage, so we're talking about 10 minutes, extra time, of course, to review the answers, that's going to greatly improve your familiarity with CARS. And the great news about CARS is that I think of all the different sections, it really is for a lot of students the easiest score to improve, especially with practice, because you develop a familiarity with the question types and with your own tendencies in answering questions. So you can compensate sometimes in the opposite direction. So practicing 6 days a week is highly recommended. And then of course, in addition to just doing 1 to 2, 3 passages a day, you also are going to want to have times where you're doing entire exam sections. So you'll of course be taking practice tests, but you want to do entire sections as well. And that might look like once a week, maybe twice a week, but you want that practice of switching between passages, because that is difficult for a lot of students to focus on a passage and then quickly go to a very new topic. And of course, you're running through this quite quickly, and you want to become comfortable with that. Number 2 is to boost your confidence. What happens, I've noticed, is a lot of students go into CARS either because they've had maybe discouraging experiences in the past with it, or they might be, they might have just heard that CARS is really difficult. And so they go in, they see a question, they're not sure of the answer, and then all the secondary talk goes on, you know, like, I'm not good at this, I bet other people are better, I bet this person I've been studying with would get this question and I'm not getting this question. And even if it's just a very subtle thought process, it's distracting. You know, you need all of your focus on reading the passage and answering the questions. And it also just makes you doubt yourself. And so start recognizing when you have some of these distracting, especially comparison thoughts going on, and just learn how to sort of quell them a bit. One thing to keep in mind is that the vast majority of CARS questions are only answered correctly by 40 to 60% of students. And so what that means is that most of the questions are right on the border of getting it right or wrong for most students. And so everyone's having that same experience, and you don't necessarily know which one other people are finding harder. So that's something that I think it helped me a little bit when I was very first going through practice tests. Number 3 is read deliberately. And so people talk a lot about the timing constraints with CARS. They are very real. You do have to go through quickly. But what takes most students the most time, where students really truly lose time, is rereading sections of the passage. And they might not even be aware they're doing this, but like sort of reading a sentence, going on a little further, then going back and saying, oh no, wait, do I understand that previous sentence? And so if you can learn how to read really deliberately just once through the passage, you're going to save a lot of time. That'll give you more time to answer the questions, and it takes a lot of focus. So it is tiring. CARS is very tiring, but you develop this practice over time. Number 4 is to use your imagination. And so this has 2 different purposes. You need to use your imagination because you're going to be struggling for attention. It's easy to start drifting off within a passage, and then especially at the end of an exam section. So you have to pretend and convince yourself that this material is riveting, absolutely engaging. And what a lot of students find is they actually do better on real CARS exams than they do on practice exams, partly because their attention is 100%. And this isn't true, of course, for all students, especially if they're struggling with test anxiety. But a lot of students just get kind of bored and fatigued answering practice CARS exam sections. And so if you can sort of develop that extreme focus that often does kick in when you're taking an actual exam, that can help. And so using your imagination as you're taking a practice exam, anything that's going to keep you just glued and riveted to the passage. And for different people, this takes on different forms. But start playing with that, experimenting with that. What makes you able to stay engaged in a passage if it's something you find boring or dry? And that really is a big part of what CARS is testing you on anyway, is can you maintain really fine-tuned attention even when the material isn't that interesting to you. The other part of use your imagination is trying to imagine the author themselves. And so this, what you'll find with CARS is that all maybe what is it, like 70% of questions or so are asking you something that relates to the author's opinion or position or argument. And if you can get a sense of who the author is, it helps a lot. So you might have even heard variations of this advice, like trying to imagine an actual voice in your head as you're reading through the passage. That's very helpful. What I find even more helpful is to actually imagine someone like a speaker on a stage. And this serves 2 purposes for me. Is in that case, I'm able to sort of like imagine that I'm hearing a voice, that I'm seeing the author, and it also kind of increases this engagement level. I pretend I'm there live, and it's some sort of famous speaker who's delivering this talk. And of course, it's a little bit hard to do because for those of you who've gone through CARS passages, a lot of times it's not until about the 3rd or 4th paragraph where you really start to get a sense of who this author is and what they're arguing. And so you have to just kind of be a little bit flexible in the beginning and take your best guess and refine it possibly as you're going along. But again, as you experiment with this technique, you're going to get better at it. And a lot of students find that that really helps. Number 5 is to be vigilant with question stems. So this is that first part of a question. All of it, of course, you need to know the passage, stems, and answer choices. But with the question stems, that's where they try to trick you. And they often try to trick you with their choice of verb. So students will read most of the question stem, but if they skim over it really quickly and they don't really focus in on what verb is being used, they'll miss the whole question, because from that, the answer choices are designed to take you in an opposite direction. So if you read the question stem really closely, then it's just that much easier to eliminate the answer choices. And then 6, good tip, drop questions that take longer than a minute. And this is because you have to pace yourself, of course. You can come back to those later if you have time. But also because sometimes within a passage, you will find clues to a question in a later question. And that's one of the good, it's a good news tidbit about cars, is that because so many of these questions are sort of setting up hypothetical scenarios, in order for the test writers to do that, they often have to say something about the text itself. And so, all of this together, I hope what you're coming away with is that through practice, all of these are going to be easier and easier to do. Cars has a very specific feel to it, a very specific rhythm. Students have their own ways of annotating, of highlighting, of approaching passages, and you do develop a rhythm over time. So at this point, I would like you to go ahead and pull up that practice passage, and I'm going to time you for 9 minutes. And then at the end of that, we'll go through the answers. a little more than halfway. One minute left. Okay, and that's time. Okay, So we're going to go through these 5, and what I want you to do is I'm going to have a poll shown in just a second. So if you have looked ahead and you've seen the actual answers, the correct answers, we're going to go through the poll, and I want you to submit your answer based on what you had initially chosen. Okay, so this particular passage is one of the easier ones, and this first question has about 60% correct response rate from students. So go ahead and indicate what you had chosen. The full text here is on, I'm not sure if you can see my screen right now, but it is in the chat. The author mentions that the Fore tribe in New Guinea in the second paragraph in order to do what? So as it suggests that some cultures have an easier time recognizing facial expressions than others, compare the utility of foreign expressions of emotions to Americans, provide evidence for her theory that facial paralysis can contribute to communication difficulties, or offer an example of a study that shows the similarity of facial expressions across cultures. Okay, very good. So you all have, as a group, chosen option D, which is the correct answer. Okay, and how do we know that this is what we want? Well, the thing that is important to pay attention to here is just this in the question. Why is this tribe even being mentioned? And what is going on in the paragraph? And so 88% of you selected correctly, which is offering the example of a study. But the second most common choice here is compare. So comparing the utility of foreign expressions of emotions to American expressions of emotions. And this is based on what we know of Magoosh students who have answered this over the course of many, many months. And so it's not, when I'm saying what the most common is, what the second most common is, it doesn't necessarily mirror what we're seeing today with all of you. This is based on students who've answered in the past. So why is it that comparing the utility is not the answer? Because what we see right at the beginning, people from both cultures show the same facial expressions for 6 basic emotions. And the reason is there's not really a true comparison going on here. So the author is saying that this tendency to automatically recognize emotions based on facial expressions is something that is true in both of these cultures, but there's not a direct comparison going on. A is not really a close match at all, because we're not looking at cultures cross-culturally and comparing which have easier or harder times. And then C, providing evidence for the theory that it can contribute to communication difficulties. That's not really going on. One thing I want to point out about the second paragraph here is that sometimes things like, there can be extra information here, like 17 of 21 studies published between 1930 and 2015. For whatever reason, I've noticed students are really likely to highlight things like that. And with CARS in particular, like the dates, the percentages, all of that, that's not, those are details that are actually usually pretty quick to come back to. And you really want to keep your focus on the big picture, because that's what almost all the questions are going to be asking. So let's move on to the next. The primary purpose of the passage is to, and here we have another poll, explain the cultural poll covers it here. Explain the cultural variations in facial expressions, detail the importance importance of compensatory mechanisms in patients born with facial paralysis. C, convince fellow research scientists that more funding needs to be devoted to facial paralysis research. And D, illuminate the communication difficulties and coping strategies of those with facial paralysis. Okay, and 63% of you said D, illuminate, and that is correct. And that again is a little bit higher correct response rate than what we've seen with students. So this is like the high 50%. And let's see, get these windows out of the way. So how do we know that that is the primary purpose? What a lot of people are trained to do is go to the bottom paragraph and use that as sort of an indication of what the primary passage might be. With CARS, they often don't set it up that way purposely because they know that that's sort of a go-to technique that's a little bit, makes things a little bit too easy. So you really have to take the full passage into consideration. And when we do that, we realize that illuminating the communication difficulties and coping strategies really hits the nail on the head a lot stronger than these others. And so what the second most common answer is the second one. So detail the importance of compensatory mechanisms in patients born with facial paralysis. The reason that that one is not the best answer choice is because of this verb detail mostly. The purpose of the passage is not to detail anything. And actually, it's very, very rare that you'll see any CARS passage that has a primary purpose of detailing. That would be listing, that would just be giving lots of facts. CARS passages are either making arguments or they're presenting some kind of research finding and usually also having a conversation with whether or not the author supports that or what the author thinks of the findings or use of the findings. So if I were to read this question because I am familiar with CARS and I had to take a guess, it would be a lot easier for me to guess because I've read a number of CARS passages. And I've read some really interesting studies where people who've just answered just tons and tons of CARS passages are actually have a fairly impressive correct response rate without even reading passages. Now, that's not a technique I recommend at all. But I point that out just to say that you start to become familiar with the questions, the answers, and also the passages, and you start to realize, oh, a CARS primary passage would never ask that. And so, yes, this last one, illuminate, is the correct answer here. Third question, which of the following is most analogous to the differing compensatory mechanisms of those with congenital versus acquired facial paralysis? Okay, and so here we have a lot of, this is definitely a reasoning beyond the text. Is it A, a woman who has lived all her life in a city has an easier time navigating its convoluted roads than someone who has moved to the city as an adult? B, a man who grew up near a lake is more comfortable swimming than someone who grew up near a river? C, a family used to traveling is more accepting of strangers than a family inexperienced in travel? Or D, an adolescent with a facial deformity has learned to be friendlier towards strangers and more respectful of authority figures in order to establish social connections? Okay, so 55% of you selected A, which is the correct answer. When large numbers of students answer these, it's actually in the 40-something percentiles. So we're looking at a CARS question that is verging on sort of a medium to difficult CARS question. And again, like I said, if you remember that it's usually a CARS question has 40 to 60% correct response rate. And there are some outliers. And you all did, as a group, quite well, but it definitely looks like it's been the more difficult so far. So let's look at why this one is the best answer. And let me look at this again. So the second one, yeah. So the second most chosen, the adolescent, that's also the way that our students answer when we look over hundreds and hundreds of students' data. So that's consistent. So a woman who's lived all her life in a city has an easier time navigating than someone who moved as an adult. So we're seeing a direct comparison. We're seeing a setup between woman who's lived all their life versus someone who has moved as an adult, and we need that because the question STEM is asking us for some sort of analogy between congenital versus acquired. So it looks good in that way, and it's saying that this person is just more skilled or has, basically more skilled at this particular task of navigation, okay? But let's look at some of these other answer choices. So I'll jump to this fourth choice here, since it is the one that students are most frequently tripped up by. An adolescent with a facial deformity has learned to be friendlier towards strangers and more respectful of authority figures in order to establish social connections. So there are kind of a few different problems with this answer choice, but they're all very subtle problems. And the one that I think is the most glaring is that we don't have any kind of direct comparison. So it says an adolescent with facial deformity has learned to be friendlier. There's some kind of comparison going on, but friendlier than what or whom? Friendlier than another person, friendlier than, let's see, there we go. Friendlier than maybe they used to be. Okay, so facial deformity. Maybe this person just developed a facial deformity recently and it's more, they're friendlier now than they used to be. So there's no direct comparison. There's also there's a little bit of extra stuff going on here, friendlier and also more respectful. That's two different descriptions. So that's another reason that it's not setting up a very clear comparison. I think the other one is this second one. So students often answer, man who grew up near a lake, more comfortable than river. And the reason that this one isn't the best is because it's the word comfortable. So here it's not a verb so much, it's the adjective of comfort. Comfort isn't really relevant. So you might be, it's very easy to sort of make the assumption that by comfort, we mean somebody is better at it. But the comfort is somewhat irrelevant to what we're trying to get at, which is skill level or ease. So that's one reason to rule that one out. And then last question. The purpose of the final paragraph is to A, offer an anecdote of the author's own experience spreading awareness of facial paralysis. B, list some difficulties that those with facial paralysis experience. C, highlight an important potential use of the research discussed in the passage. Or D, summarize the main points about facial paralysis mentioned in the passage. Okay, so we have, again, the correct answer that highlighted, selected by you. in the greatest proportion, but now we have a little under than 50% of you that have chosen this. And that is also consistent with Magoosh students overall, is high 40s for this one. And so let's look at this one. Highlight an important potential use of the research discussed in the passage. So in this last paragraph, what's going on? Well, at this point, the author has sort of described her own experience, why she's interested in it. She's sort of taken this leap from looking at, objective research to talking at a more personal level, and then making more of an argument here. And what's going on in this last paragraph? So she's saying that we need more public awareness, and that by doing that, it's going to produce a better communication experience for people who have the disability as well as those who do not. And so the option of highlighting an important potential use of the research is correct. So an important potential use of the research would be to raise public awareness. Partly what makes this difficult is because it's not saying research directly. So you go to this last passage or paragraph, you know that it's talking about research as sort of the main thing going on here. And some of the other options are more closer. It's easier to see the connection between research, but there are other problems with these other answer choices. So the let's see, list some. This is the option B, is the one that is second most frequently chosen by students. I believe, does it list some of the difficulties? Yeah, I think it is. And then it's also the first one. So those two are actually pretty close. They're close in frequency. So offer an anecdote of the author's own experience spreading awareness of facial paralysis. Well, that's not really the purpose. So there's a focus group, but no public awareness is really being spread. Not yet. That's kind of what the call is to do. And then B, list some of the difficulties they experience. No, that's kind of earlier in the passage. There is a difficulty being discussed here. It's not the primary purpose. And then this last one, summarize the main points about facial paralysis mentioned in the passage. There's not, this isn't really a summary. So they're not going into the research on universal facial expressions. And then again, kind of like one of the other questions that we went over, it's rare for a CARS passage to summarize at the end. That's not the technique they use. They tend to be quite difficult passages where it can be a little difficult to connect one paragraph to another. And summarizing, you might get that in some ACT passages, maybe in some more ACT passages, some SAT passages, but in CARS, you rarely see that. So that could be eliminated probably by somebody who hadn't read the passage but had a lot of experience. And again, we're going to be answering Q&A in just like a couple minutes here. And so I'm hoping that you'll submit questions that speak to CARS strategies broadly and how to structure your practice, your study. But if you need to, we will answer questions you have about some of these other answer choices. If not live, then we'll do it through chat, or we'll get back to you. And now we're at the last one. So based on the information in the passage, it can be inferred that congenitally blind people display the same facial expressions as everyone else because A, the display of emotion is an important Darwinian survival mechanism. B, facial expressions are an inborn rather than learned behavior. C, their muscle memory allows them to retain command of the 6 major facial expressions. Or D, they have learned the importance of communicating visually despite their impairments. So submit the answer that you had selected when you were going through this. It looks like there's a discrepancy here with the question. So you all, I'm not sure, let's see which one. They have learned facial, oh, it's the order. Facial, okay, yeah. So 47% said facial expressions are inborn. That is the correct answer. And the second most was the display of, which is also the second most commonly selected answer by students at large. And these, they're similar, right? So both of them are talking about this idea that there's some sort of inborn component, what nature over nurture, you might say, about the way that humans spontaneously express emotions. So facial expressions are an inborn rather than learned behavior. Why is that the better answer choice? Then the display of emotion is an important Darwinian survival mechanism. This one's a little bit tricky. I think the best way of explaining why A is not the best answer is that, you know, in the beginning here, you know, they talk about Darwin. They say that there's, you know, some sort of maybe evolutionary advantages to this trait, but survival, saying survival is kind of the problematic word here. So we know that there might be an evolutionary advantage, but evolutionary advantage could mean, I mean, it could mean that there's higher survival in people who have this ability to read emotions or express emotions. But it could also just mean that maybe it's due to mating behavior, you know, like that there could be, or we don't have in this passage a clear explanation of why it's an evolutionary advantage. We know that it's inborn, we know that Darwin mentioned it, so, but we don't go into the actual theories about the ways in which this inborn mechanism specifically links to any kind of propagation of the species. And then these others, so let's see, the C, can this be inferred? Muscle memory allows them to retain command. No, because the word retain suggests that there's some sort of learning. Retain means over time, something that's lost, or something that could be lost that is not. And some people are born with this. And then we've got D, because they've learned the importance of communicating visually despite their impairments. And that's not, we can't really infer that from this passage. So the importance of communicating is not mentioned in this passage as something that people learn. It's more that it is important and it is a compensatory mechanism, and that also congenitally blind people have this inborn ability to express the same emotions that others do. And so that is the end of the passage. You all did very well. And at this point, I think we can move to Q&A.
Awesome. We have a bunch of great questions already, but please drop your questions. If you have them in the question box, we'll be taking them as we go along. Why don't we start with, how do you suggest we practice for CARS if we don't have access to any previous MCAT exams?
If you don't have access to previous MCAT exams, so previous, I'm not entirely sure what the student might mean by previous, or so maybe it's easier to back up a little bit and say, where do you practice? Where do you find these passages? So there are the 4 official practice tests that most students save until the middle to end of their studies. So those are good, but you don't want to use those for practicing cars because you want to save them. The AAMC has question banks of CARS questions. So they have 2 different packages. Those are really good. I know that when they were first released, there were some complaints that AAMC had included some passages that were from the old MCAT. I think they might have eliminated those, but even though those were present when they were first released, the vast majority are for the new MCAT. So those are some places. There are many free sources online, but you want to make sure that you have CARS-like passages. So our Magoosh's CARS passages, actually, we keep data on them, and they do have pretty high reliability. So kind of like I was going through with you, the 40 to 60% correct response rate, and also the internal consistency of how students answer we have data on that it's quite robust. We've also gotten that feedback from students. So Magoosh students, Magoosh is one place you can definitely find questions. Khan Academy also has CARS. They have CARS lessons. They have some CARS passages. Their passages aren't maybe quite as difficult. Exam Crackers, you can purchase 10 practice tests from them that are quite good. Exam Crackers has been around for a long time. I think their practice tests are quite decent. They're not a live platform like us, but I often recommend them. Overall, though, you do want, I think that official materials are best. And in addition to maybe getting the question bank, I recommend getting the official guide that's published. The official guide talks about the CARS section, and it also has some passages that they work through with you, which I really like. And so you can kind of go through and they explain the reasoning beyond the text, within the text, how we know one is the other. So those are great sources. That's what I recommend.
Awesome. Let's move on to a question about timing. So we have some people asking, what's the best way to balance spending enough time reading the passage, but still avoiding running out of time? What would you recommend on just timing and CARS in general?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So we know that most students spend about half their time reading passages and half their time answering the questions. Unfortunately, most students also run out of time on the CARS exam section. If you look at where the time is going, however, a lot of that time, like I said at the very beginning, is going to rereading the passage as they're reading it. Students who can develop the skill of going through the passage in a fairly detailed, not super fast way, because CARS passages are difficult. You really have to be able to follow the argument. You can't skim these things the way you can with some SAT, ACT passages. But if you can stay focused enough that you're not going back and reading, you can actually usually get through the passages in a quite a quicker amount of time. So it's not the same thing as speeding up your reading. It kind of is, but you don't want to be rushing through your reading. The other thing you don't want to do is you don't want to spend a lot of time searching for answers within the text. And if you read thoroughly the first time, you're going to save a lot of time answering the questions. The questions are rarely detailed questions, so you don't have to do as much consultation with the text as you might think, because most of the questions aren't asking you about details of the text. You do want to do that, and you do want to be really careful because they will try and trip you up with subtleties about verb choice and subtleties about meaning. But I think that those are some ways. Another thing is that students sometimes take too many notes. With cars, I recommend very minimal notes. Outlining can be nice if it helps keep you on track as you're reading. Minimal highlighting, but you want to keep your focus on the main point and the argument. So I noticed that too, is that students sometimes lose a lot of time taking notes in the margins. So those are,
Awesome. Great. So kind of a follow-up to that, but about how to organize how we approach the cars section. Um, is there a benefit to previewing all the passages first and then organizing them by difficulty, or should you be hitting stuff in the order that you're seeing it?
I really like this question. So I used to really recommend that students do skim the passages first and then start with passages that seem the most friendly to them. I don't say easy because you don't really know if a passage is easy or hard until you're quite a ways into it. Sometimes it becomes really tricky towards the end because there's a subtle spin on an argument that makes it hard. But a lot of times students do know, maybe they like the social science passages better than the humanities or vice versa, or the topic just inherently grabs them. So I do like the idea of going through and answering passages that seem friendly first. However, over time, I've learned from students that a whole lot of students really prefer to just go through sequentially, and they don't have they have good outcomes also. So it's kind of a personal choice. What I would caution is don't develop too complicated mechanisms of going through. So for instance, you don't want to be like going back and forth a whole lot. You don't want to be flipping around a whole lot. What some students do is they just start with the beginning, and if the first passage, intending to answer it, and if it doesn't look like a friendly passage to them, they might skip to the second, but they're not skimming through all of them. They're kind of still approaching them sequentially, and then of course coming back to the first one. But ultimately, there's a lot of tips and tricks out there about cars passages, and a lot of it comes down to personal preference. You'll find gimmicks, you'll find people that are just convinced that one way's better than another. A lot of the techniques that are recommended will work for some students and not others. And what you really want to do, because it's part of this second thing here on boosting confidence, is you want to develop your own style and love it. And for me, part of my style is I really love approaching the paragraphs or passages out of order. But you want to do what is comfortable to you, that feels like your own way.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question. I just want to let students know that if we didn't get to your question today, one of the benefits of being a Magoosh Premium subscriber is academic support. You can message us at help@magoosh.com and we can answer offline. But let's do one last question about practicing. So do you recommend when you start practicing cars that you start timing yourself from the beginning, or should you spend some time focusing on the passage, understanding the questions and the format when you start out?
Okay, I also love this question. So almost every single source is going to tell you time from the beginning. And I'm maybe one of the only instructors who recommends going through a section once untimed. And I think it's partly because it takes some of the anxiety component out. It makes cars a little bit more fun. You'll have a higher response rate that's correct, and that boosts your confidence, because when you start to maybe get lower scores later when you do them quickly, you can remember that first time and say, well, I remember that actually, until I was trying to do it under timed conditions, I was answering more correctly, and now it's just a matter of getting the timing down. So I do recommend going through at least once in an untimed format. You then do everything timed because it's part of the game. Then, very important parting words of advice is to make sure that you read the answer explanations with a lot of detail. Read them very, very thoroughly. Every single answer choice, even if it seems like a no-brainer, throw out answer choice, you got it right, read them all, because you're going to learn a lot about cars by reading the answer explanations. And I think that's all we have time for today. So thanks so much for joining us. We will get to questions that we didn't answer here live, and good luck to you.